my little year fours, how are you? Here's your first English lesson of this half term. So we're starting a new topic. We were going to do the Great Choco Plot, but I couldn't get hold of the book in time. So we're going to flip round what we're going to do for English, and we're going to do Charlie and the Chocolate Factory this half term. And then next half term, or maybe towards the end of this half term, if we've got time, we'll move on to the Great Choco Plot because the book should be here very soon. So, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And you'll be pleased to hear that today's lesson is going to involve absolutely no writing, okay? All you're going to be doing is listening to the story. We're going to be thinking about the plot up until the point where Charlie finds the golden ticket. I'm pretty sure that all of you know this story really well. The other thing you could do, if you've got Amazon Prime at home, or maybe you've got the DVD or the video or the film some other way, I know that you can get the old version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is called Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the one that was made in the 1970s. And you can also get the new version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory where Johnny Depp plays Willy Wonka. You can get them both on Amazon Prime. If you wanted to have a nice cozy morning watching movies, if nobody's using the TV, and if you've got Amazon Prime, it would be great if you could watch just up to where Charlie gets the golden ticket. Okay, so settle down, get yourself a blanket, get yourself a drink if you want to, get yourself maybe a biscuit if you're allowed, or a little snack, and we're going to enjoy a little bit of a story to get us into the plot of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So here we go. Chapter 1. Here comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket, and this is Mrs. Bucket. And Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. There's Charlie. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He's pleased to meet you. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups, count them: Grandpa Joe, Grandma Josephine, Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, Mr. Bucket, Mrs. Bucket, and Charlie lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. Is there a small wooden house? The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable, a bit like it is for some of us at the moment. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired that they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe, Grandma Josephine on this side, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on that side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie slept in the other room upon mattresses on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house, or even one that had more beds to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays. because then, although they'd had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about feeling morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all. And although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else in the world was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day he would see other children taking bars of creamy chocolate out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvellous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box which he owned and treasure it as though it was a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of paper, wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate, and then he would take just a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely, sweet taste to spread all over his tongue. And the next day he would take another tiny nibble, and then so on and so on. And in this way, Charlie would make his 6-penny bar of birthday chocolate last for more than a month.
Wow.
But I haven't told you yet about the awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching bars of creamy chocolate right in front of him. It was the most terrible and torturing thing you could imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there has ever been. And what a tremendous and marvellous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading up to it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing noises coming from deep inside it and outside the walls for half a mile around it, in every direction. The air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of chocolate. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory, and every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Should we do that? You ready? You smell the chocolate?
No.
You have to use your imagination. Oh, how he loved that smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. Right, that's the end of chapter 1. So what have we learned so far? We have learned, haven't we, that, so this is our first chapter here. Can you see that? first chapter, we have met the Bucket family. And what do we know about the Bucket family? We know that they're quite poor, don't we? We know that they're poor. And we know that they're quite hungry. We also know that there is a chocolate factory in their town. Okay, right. So we're going to go on next to chapter 2 and find out what happens in chapter 2. So you can draw this if you like in your notepad. Right, Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. In the evenings, after he'd finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes, good simile there, and as bony as skeletons. Another one there, you could write those down to use in your writing if you like. And throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus for perhaps half an hour, every night this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. Look at them there. They're enjoying their evening chat.
And
Charlie's
in the middle.
Yeah, he's right in the middle of the bed. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on the pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew that he was very clever." "Clever?" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as it can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," said little Charlie. "Good heavens above. I don't know what's the matter with me." "Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe?" "I certainly will. Sit down beside me here on the bed and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anybody can be.
It's not.
Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak. And throughout the day he spoke very little, but in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvellous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka," cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he's invented more than 200 kinds of chocolate bar, each with a different centre, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than any other chocolate factories can make?" Perfectly true, cried Grandma Josephine. And he sends them to all the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe? Now, do you think it means four corners of the earth? What do you think that means, Eloise?
Everywhere in the world.
Everywhere in the world, because we know, don't we, that the world hasn't got corners.
No, because it's a circle. It's a sphere.
It's a sphere, yeah.
So it can't have corners.
Yeah, so it's just a way of saying, like, everywhere in the world. It is, my dear, it is, and to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only chocolate bars that he makes. Oh dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve. Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the refrigerator? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny. Now, I'm going to let you know that tomorrow you're going to be designing your own chocolate bar or chocolate kind of invention or sweet invention.
Right.
So if you want to make notes from the book to give you ideas, so for example, a chocolate ice cream that can stay cold. Eloise has written a little note in her book to remind you could write that down, because that's quite a nice idea, isn't it? But that's impossible, said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, cried Grandpa Joe. It's absolutely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Wonka has done it. Quite right.
Well, then it's not
and
impossible.
Then again, Grandpa Joe went on speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramels that change colour every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and sugar balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely blue birds' eggs with black spots on them. And when you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller and sugary until there's nothing left except a tiny pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said little Charlie, but please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that. You mean Prince Pondicherry, said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely dotty, said Grandpa George, but very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Said Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I'll tell you. And that's the end of chapter 2. So what have we learned in chapter 2? What do we know now that we didn't know in chapter 1?
That there was a prince who was very rich.
Yeah, so there's somebody called Prince Pondicherry that
I can never remember his name.
That we're going to hear about in the next chapter. But we also know that each evening, what happens each evening in the Bucket household?
When Charlie's come home, the 4 grandparents get really excited and talk a lot and tell stories.
So each evening when Charlie gets home,
there's excitement.
There's excitement, and they pile onto the bed and tell stories and have chats. And we know that they love Charlie. The family all love Charlie. Just like all your families love you lot. Right. So, on to chapter 3. You can always pause the video if you need to run and go to the loo or get yourself glass of water, so
Or
don't worry.
finished writing.
Or finish your writing. You can always pause your video. Right, number 3, chapter 3. Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka, said Grandpa Joe, and asked him to come all the way out to India and build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. There's that amazing word colossal that I know you like using in your writing. Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa? He did indeed. And what a palace it was. It had 100 rooms, and
100?
everything was made of either dark or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate. The cement holding them together was chocolate. The windows were chocolate. All the walls and ceilings were made of chocolate. So were the carpets and the pictures and the furniture and the beds. And when you turned the taps on in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, I warn you, though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away. Nonsense, shouted the prince. I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it.
I'm going to lick the walls and eat it all up.
I bet you are. But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this, there came a very hot day with a boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt, and then it sank slowly to the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in a huge brown sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was so bright and his eyes stretched so wide that you could see the whites all around them, like mine. Is this really true? He asked, or are you pulling my leg? It's true, cried all the young people at once, the old people rather at once. Of course it's true. Ask anyone else you like, and I'll tell you something else that's true, said Grandpa Joe, and now he leaned closer to Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. Nobody ever comes out. Out of where? Said Charlie. And nobody ever goes in. In where? Said Charlie. Wonka's factory, of course. Grandpa, what do you mean? I mean workers, Charlie. Workers? All factories, said Grandpa Joe, have workers streaming in and out of the gates in the mornings and evenings, except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out?
No.
Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the 4 old faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. Yes, they were. There was no sign of joking or leg pulling on any of them. Well, have you? Said Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa, Charlie stammered. Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed. Exactly, said Grandpa Joe. But there must be people working there. Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway. Then who? Aha, that's it, you see. There's another one of Mr. Willy Wonka's clevernesses. Charlie, dear, Mrs. Bucket called out from where she was standing by the door. It's time for bed. That's enough for tonight. But, Mother, I must hear. Tomorrow, darling. That's right, said Grandpa Joe. I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow. Right, so all we found out in chapter 3 was what?
That Prince Pondicherry wanted him to build a castle out of chocolate, and there came a hot day, and he woke up swimming in the chocolate lake.
Yeah.
And nobody ever goes into the factory. Nobody ever comes out of the factory.
Brilliant.
And no one knows who works in the factory.
Okay.
I said here. Doop. Doop.
Okay, right, so...
That's not how I wrote it. I wrote it like this.
Okay, well, that's the thing with notes. You can do notes however you like. Your notes look like that. My notes look like this.
Yes.
This is how we do our plot points in year 4.
I just
Maybe you're not writing notes at all. Maybe you're just listening and enjoying the story. That's absolutely fine. Right, let's find out about these secret workers next.
in chapter 4.
And I'm thinking we might call it a day after this chapter for today, and then we'll go on to the next bit tomorrow. Okay. The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with his story. You see, Charlie, he said, not so very long ago, there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Wonka's factory. And then one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home, never to come back. But why? Asked Charlie. Because of spies. Spies? Yes. All the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful sweets Mr. Wonka was making, and they started sending in the spies to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a certain special thing was made. And did they go back to their own factories and tell? Asked Charlie. They must have, answered Grandpa Joe, because soon after that, Fickle Gruber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, even in the hottest sun. And then Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavour, however much you chewed it. And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began making sugar balloons that you could blow up to huge sizes before you popped them with a pin and gobbled them up. And so on, and so on. And Mr. Willy Wonka tore his beard and shouted, "This is terrible! I shall be ruined! There are spies everywhere! I shall have to close the factory!" But he didn't do that, Charlie said. Oh, yes, he did. He told all the workers that he was sorry, but they would have to go home. Then he shut the main gates and fastened them with a chain, and suddenly Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted. The chimney stopped smoking, the machines stopped whirring, and from then on, not a single chocolate or sweet was made, not a soul went in or out, and even Mr. Willy Wonka himself disappeared completely. Months and months went by, Grandpa Joe went on, but still the factory remained closed, and everybody said, "Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice and he made such marvellous things, but he's finished now, it's all over." And then something astonishing happened. One day, early in the morning, thin columns of white smoke were seen to be coming out of the tops of the tall chimneys on the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. "What's going on?" they cried. "Someone's lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again." They ran to the gates expecting to see them wide open and Mr. Wonka standing there to welcome his workers back. But no. The great iron gates were still locked and chained as securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. "But the factory is working," the people shouted. "Listen, you can hear the machines. They're all whirring again, and you can smell the smell of melting chocolate in the air." Grandpa Joe leaned forward and laid a long, bony finger on Charlie's knee, and he said softly, "But most mysterious of all were the shadows in the windows of the factory. The people standing on the street outside could see small shadows moving about behind the frosted glass." "Shadows of whom?" said Charlie quickly. Whom, like it's an old-fashioned way of saying who.
I know.
That's exactly what everyone else wanted to know. "The place is full of workers," the people shouted, "but nobody's in. The gates are locked. It's crazy. Nobody ever comes out either." But there was no question at all. said Grandpa Joe, that the factory was running, and it's gone on running ever since for these last 10 years. And what's more, the chocolates and sweets it's been turning out have become more fantastic and delicious all the time. And of course now, when Mr. Wonka invents some new and wonderful sweet, neither Mr. Fickelgruber, nor Mr. Podnose, nor Mr. Slugworth, nor anybody is able to copy it. No spies can go into the factory to find out how it's made. But Grandpa, who? Cried Charlie. Who is Wonka using to do all the work in the factory? Nobody knows, Charlie. But that's absurd. Hasn't someone asked Mr. Wonka? Nobody sees him anymore. He never comes out. The only things that come out of that place are chocolate and sweets.
Yummy.
They come out through a special trapdoor in the wall, all packed and addressed. And then they're picked up every day by post office trucks. But Grandpa, what sort of people are they that work in there? My dear boy, said Grandpa Joe, that is one of the great mysteries of the chocolate making world. We all know only one thing about them. They are very small.
True.
The faint shadows that sometimes appear behind the windows, especially late at night when lights are on, are those of tiny people. People no taller than my knee.
My knee or
There
your knee?
aren't any such people. Grandpa Joe's knee, Charlie said. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory and he was waving an evening newspaper rather excitedly. Have you heard the news? He cried. He held up the paper so they could see the huge headline. The headline said, Wonka factory to be opened at last to lucky few. Right, so that's the end of chapter 4. Tomorrow we'll do the next few chapters to get up to the point where Charlie finds the golden ticket. What happened in chapter 4, Eloise? What's just happened right now?
Mr. Bucket came home with the evening newspaper.
So the chocolate factory is going to be opened, isn't it?
Yeah. And Charlie was listening to the story.
Yeah, Charlie was listening to Grandpa Joe and they were talking about the
Spies trying to steal the ideas, but then the factory being closed and nobody has ever seen Mr. Wonka. And then suddenly, like months later, smoke was coming out, so everybody rushed to the place and they saw strange shadows.
Yeah, and what those little shadows? What do you think they were?
Jumpers.
Little shadows. Yeah, we've not met them yet, but that's our first clue that the workers in the factory are really small.
I know what they are, though.
So, boys and girls, as it was the first day back after the holidays, I've gone easy on you today, and you've listened to the story. Those of you that really enjoy writing, you could try writing out the plot points like Eloise and I have done. That's Eloise's. So we all write notes differently, okay? And that's mine. So you can do your own notes.
Mine is way more messy.
You could also, if you want to, you could put some illustrations on there. So this bit here where you meet the Bucket family, if you want to, you could draw me a little picture of Charlie and his family. You could draw a little picture of the chocolate factory. Over here you could draw the prince and the chocolate palace. And over here you could draw the spies trying to steal the ideas if you want to. So if you want to do that, take a little picture of your work or do it on a Google Doc and upload it to the classroom, and I'll have a look later on and we'll have more tomorrow, okay? Take care. Lovely to see you. Bye. Say bye, Lulu.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.